All right, hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Freedom Papers, powered by Turning Point USA and hosted by me, Morgan Zegers. I am really so excited because today we have a special guest, one of my best friends, and my roommate, Alex Spencer.
Hello.
So, hi. I
Hi.
want to give you a chance to introduce yourself and stuff, but first I want to give everybody some quick rundowns, just some housekeeping things, you guys. Welcome back to the podcast. If you haven't listened to the first, 9 or 8 episodes, I don't even know anymore. We're just having a blast. There's a good amount of episodes that we've done so far. I want you to catch up, but here's the thing. Don't just listen to this podcast and say, well, now I know everything I need to know about the ratification debates. Okay, I want you guys to get a copy of the Anti-Federalist Papers, get a copy of the Federalist, and make sure that you're reading the actual founding documents and all of the books about them yourself. Get your own opinions on them, and then we come into this podcast and we have a good discussion on it and relate it to what's going on these days. Now, here's the thing. We have a podcast, Instagram, Freedom Papers Podcast, at Freedom Papers Podcast. That's where I post some of the more fun behind-the-scenes stuff and kind of tease out about what's going to come out this week. But here's the thing. America Fest is coming up, okay? Are you going to be at America Fest?
Of course I'm going to be at America Fest.
Okay, good. If you go, I found out. I'm like an influencer now, apparently, Alex Spencer.
Yep.
Also, I always say her last name. It's just Alex
It's okay.
Spencer. But it's just, there's no other way. Alex Spencer, USA.
Mm-hmm.
Now, America Fest, Alex is going to be there. I'm going to be there. All of the Turning Point guys and girls are going to be there. And I found out from Marina and from some of the higher ups here that I have a code for 25% off a ticket. Now, this is like a whole shebang, a country music concert and conservative speakers like Brantley Gilbert and Ray Lynn and all these really cool people. And they're still announcing new artists. But like, it costs a lot to go see those people in person. And so not only do you get to like see all these multiple singers, but now it's going to be like Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, a ton of really big speakers in the conservative movement, and we're coming together for a big thing. So 25% off your ticket. Use code Morgan. How cool is that? I get my own code.
Very cool.
At tpusa.com/AmericaFest. Use code Morgan. And we'll see you there, you guys. It's here in Phoenix, Arizona, and I'm excited to see everyone there.
Yep.
Are you excited?
It's going to be awesome. As they say, anybody who is anybody will be there here in Phoenix.
I feel like you're a little biased because...
No, not at all, never.
So how about, that's a good intro for like, why are you biased? What do you do here, Alex Spencer?
am.
Because we are at Turning Point USA headquarters. I grabbed Alex from the office and said, I'm bringing you into the studio. You're joining me today to talk about these things. Because we talk about these issues at home all the time. Like, we'll be making dinner and we're talking about the ratification debate, or we're talking about what's going on in the world. And I was like, Alex would actually be an amazing guest. We should film ourselves talking about it. So that's why you're here. You're amazing. And she does really cool behind the scenes work specifically here at Turning Point HQ. So I grabbed you from your desk. What were you doing?
So I am the influencer media manager here. So I get to work with all of our amazing influencers like Morgan. So when Morgan says...
Oh, I'm an influencer.
I'm an influencer. Alex, did you
oh,
know? I say,
thank you.
Yes, I did. Actually, that's my job. So that is why I'm here. Morgan stole me away. I'm excited to switch it up a little bit and talk about history.
Yeah.
Probably ask a lot of questions that hopefully everybody listening to this may also have as well.
You're going to get learnt today.
Get educated,
You're going to get learnt today,
schooled,
baby.
as they say.
Oh, I love that.
Schooled.
Well, thank you for taking the hour to
Thank you
join
for
us.
having
Now, we're going to do a little recap. I know you listen to every episode of Freedom Papers.
I do.
Don't just stop
I'm the
yourself
biggest Morgan
before you
Zegers fan.
upset me and say that you don't. I'm
No,
just going to assume that you do.
Mhm.
If you've been following along, or perhaps you're new to this, for the first few episodes, we kind of did a history on the papers. What was the ratification debate? We had some really cool members on from the Congress. We had Paul Gosar. We had Andy Biggs. Andy Biggs is the chairman of the House Freedom Caucus. That's like a big deal. And so we got to talk to him about Federalist Paper number 1 and about, in general, the ratification debates. But then we did some solo episodes and we talked about papers 2 through 5. Those were about foreign influence and why it's really bad if we are not united as a country. Because when we're all disunited as all these little states on the land that is now America, all these foreign influences, they see that as, okay, we can divide and conquer. And we don't even have to try and divide ourselves. These guys are already divided and fighting.
They did it for us.
Right? And so papers 2 through 5 were all about that. But now we're doing paper 7 today. And last episode was paper 6. Paper 6 and 7 are both called Concerning Dangers from Dissensions Between the States. That was the name of number 6. Number 7 today is just a continuation of the subject.
Yep.
Now, paper number 6, it basically said, First of all, let's go about this. What were the Anti-Federalists saying? Because the Anti-Federalists versus the Federalists is the whole point of this ratification debate. And I don't know if you knew this, Alex, but the Anti-Federalists, maybe they didn't win, right? I mean, they didn't want the U.S. Constitution to be ratified, but they are really responsible for why we have the Bill of Rights. Okay, so they didn't like just the Constitution alone. And the agreement was that, okay, Bill of Rights, we've got that, then we know that this won't be turning into tyranny in just a couple years. So the Anti-Federalists, when they looking at the dangers from states not being united, their take on it was that if we had small confederacies, if we had all these small states unjoined on this land by a union, we would have incentive to all get along. Doesn't that seem a little naive?
It seems like this utopian kind of description that we hear about a lot.
And so their purposes were like, oh, well, we would want to have trade with each other and commerce, and there would be financial incentive to, first of all, succeed in that economy with all this great trade between the states. And it would be expensive for us to go to war. We wouldn't want to do that. And we would have all of this stuff that encourages our best interest, which would be to not go to war.
But
sounds like nice, right?
Sounds really nice.
What the Federalists said, and this was something where I was really on the Federalist side. Sometimes I go back and forth, but I was really on the Federalist side on this for number 6, because they were like, guys, have you not seen any of human history? Like, have you seen why people go to war? Have you seen the sizes of countries that go to war? Sometimes it's just town versus town, huge nations versus huge dynasties, all this stuff. But at the end of the day, it's pretty obvious that even if there is financial incentive to not go to war, people still go to war. And then not only that, but financial incentive is also the reason most people go to war. You know, it's like, it's not only not going to prevent us, but it's often the cause. And so that's why I really liked it, the whole discussion. And so the Federalist paper, it looked at history. It looked at like, okay, let's look at the history of Europe. I mean, it's all these tiny little countries. If you think about it, like states in America are the size of countries in Europe.
Right.
You know what I mean? And so
we're huge.
The Federalist papers are like, let's look at Europe. They're tiny. They should want to get along, right? Because it's best for their trade. But instead, they like cut people's heads off. And that's what with Queen Elizabeth I. She cut her own cousin's head off, beheaded it, because they were fighting over who would get to control certain aspects of the area. Now, they looked at European history. They also look at Greece, because inside of Greece, you have Athens and Sparta, and all these small states that aren't united, aren't encouraged to cooperate, and they end up fighting. And what happened to that? The downfall of Athens. It was just the downfall of their democratic republic government. And it's really sad to see. And bottom line is they kind of like really smash the hammer down on the idea that financial incentives will encourage cooperation. They said there's so many examples of this not being the case that it would be silly to look past it. So that was paper number 6. Now we're going to talk about paper number 7. Same kind of topics. Oh, yes. Thank you. Thank you, Alex. Same kind of topic. So it's a continuation of number 6, and it's called The Same Subject Continued. This one is also written by Hamilton. 6 and 7 were by Hamilton. What he's saying? He's saying, we are no different than any other country throughout history. To act like we would be is a little naive. So
how timely is that? We have to keep saying that of like, but just look at every single country at every point in history. Why do we want to be more like those places where this has failed? And that's what makes America exceptional, is that it's a new concept, and that's why it works, is that it learned from those histories.
Yeah, well, and that's what's so interesting. There's 2 things that really get me so excited there is, first of all, our founders back then were looking at history saying, well, let's not repeat it. Let's learn from it to not repeat it. And imagine having that mindset before the 20th century, before this whole thing of like socialism and Marxism, because Marx didn't come for years later, hundreds. He wasn't around for a long time after this. This was in 1787. And so now in America today, we look at the 20th century, we look at the failures of leftism, and we say, let's learn from history before we repeat it and become the next country in a line of many to fall to this. And unfortunately, so many in America are falling for it hard, and it's very disappointing. But what you said right there really is the key here, and I want everybody to constantly, as we go through this episode, relate what's going on in this ratification debate in this paper to what's going on in America, because so many people are cheaply saying, I'd rather be disunited. I'd rather just separate. I don't care anymore. I don't want those people to be in our country. We're too different. And like, let's go to civil war. Let's have a national divorce. All these things. We've got to separate into 3 or 4 confederacies. Guys, this is not a new conversation. This was had in 1787. It was hostile, the debate back and forth. I mean, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists go at each other. And it's because it's a really serious topic. It's not something frivolous to talk about behind a microphone. And so I think it's so disrespectful that all of these points of contention have been addressed and discussed, and it was decided. It's still worth it for us to come together. Even if we do have these problems, even if it is a little bit risky to try this new form of government, it's better for us to be united because of all of history showing us we are weaker when we're disunited. Right. And now you have people in America, even conservatives, saying, I could go for some national divorce. That's why I'm excited to have you on to this, because you're very aware of all the people that are saying that right now. You know what I mean?
And it's a lot of people, too, that I have the utmost respect for who are saying that, and they talk about, okay, is it worth having a national divorce in order to prevent a civil war? But when you look about the character of the people that we're talking about being divided against, those people are not just passive, let me do my own thing type people. Those people are the ones that are burning down their own cities and small businesses and throwing bricks through windows. And you think that you are going to separate from those people and they're going to leave you alone? Those people don't want America to exist. They don't want to be separate from it. They want it to not exist. They think that America is inherently bad. And when you think something is inherently bad, you want to destroy it.
And bingo. Okay. Well, you just kind of skipped ahead. And I know that I didn't give you preparatory stuff on this, but that's a big part of it. Is the founders address the fact of, like, even if there's no trade incentive, even if there's no, financial incentive for people to fight, sometimes it's just morality. Right. Sometimes people disagree enough on morality, and social justice is what they said. Social justice, written back in 1787. Imagine. That can lead to a war between brothers, between neighbor countries. So I'm excited that you said that, because when I got to that part in the paper, I was like,
bell.
Oh,
ding ding, right track.
I am such a slow reader. I think you saw that, because I've read the Federalist Papers back, in college and stuff. Yeah. But when I'm reading it for this podcast, I do not skip ahead. Like, when I'm about to film an episode, I will read that chapter and fully evaluate it, because each of them is a different conversation. And a lot of people don't understand that at the time, these were individual essays. All of these papers, they weren't put together in the Federalist book at first. Right. Instead, they were released as individual papers on each subject. And then later on in American history, all of the papers written by the Federalists were put together into a book called The Federalist. And so that's why I'm not just whipping through as if it's chapter after chapter. I want to evaluate each subject, talk about it with you guys, and then move on to the next one. So what I usually do, Alex, I like to get my strongest quotes that I enjoyed the most, or that I think make great points from the paper. And then we kind of go point by point. And we'll start with this first quote. It was basically Hamilton saying, you guys, we're going to face the same problems seen throughout history. Okay, so a good general quote is, he says, "It is sometimes asked with an air of unseeming triumph what inducements the states have, if disunited, to make war upon each other. It would be a full answer to this question to say, precisely the same inducements which have, at times, deluged in blood all the nations in the world." So it's pretty simple there. He's saying we are not special or unique in the way of being able to avoid conflict, but we can create a government that helps us limit that kind of conflict. And we can try and avoid some of the more common causes.
And I think, too, it's like you don't need to hyper-analyze the reasons behind these. Like, what he's saying is that it's just the same thing that has happened to every point of contention across nations throughout history. It's like, why even bother asking the question? It's like bothering to ask the question, okay, why won't socialism work in America? It's like, well, we don't even have to have that conversation because it's just proven to have not. Like, we do not have to have these questions floating around when we have the answers. It's proven time and time again not to work. That's all we need to know.
Yeah, and it's basically just mankind's human nature.
Yes,
that's how I see it, and that's how the founders saw it too. Is you can't stop human nature. You can't stop the tendencies of men to disagree and to end up having little disagreements turn into hostile conflicts with massive amounts of people dying. This reminded me, before we get into it, I just want to remind everyone, our founders looked at every single attempt at a republic-style government in human history. They looked at why every single one of them failed, because every single one of them had failed. And they said, okay, well, what can we do to make sure that we give ourselves the best shot possible? Because clearly it's hard. Mankind, human nature is going to lead to lots of hostilities and problems. We're not going to be perfect. But what can we do to limit these problems and really try and preserve dignity, liberty, and happiness?
Right.
Now, what was so cool, I don't think you didn't come with me to this, but I went to the Goldwater Institute's dinner, they asked me to say the pledge. So I was like, heck yeah. So now that I live in Arizona, I was like, oh, I would love that, because they're a big Arizona group and stuff. And Governor DeSantis was the speaker. And so I got to see him, and I'm sitting there, obviously I'm excited no matter what. But guess what he brings up? The Federalist Papers. Oh. And so I'm like, I'm not filming. Oh my gosh. I wanted to get footage of it. But he ended up saying that exact same thing. And I'm such a nerd about it. I mean, everybody listening, you know how much I care about this stuff. He ends up talking about, I cannot believe our founders looked at every failure of human history, especially the failures of the republics, and they did their best to give us this document that would preserve our liberty in the best way. And we have people today rejecting it. It's a shame. And I'm just like...
And just ignoring all of those lessons that people throughout history had to learn. Like, we are not just some unstable foundation. The most instability comes from just people on the inside trying to destroy us because we don't understand the history. We don't understand that the foundation of America comes from an analysis of all of those successes and failures throughout history.
And I've got to say, a lot of people are scared right now of federal tyranny, and they see these mandates and they're so nervous. And I try and spread the message of, you guys, it's not that we are in a situation where we have to comply. It's just that we don't understand our power here, that we can say no, we can provide the check. Right. And a lot of that is on state power. Okay, so like when I build my family, I want to build my family and put my children in a state where I know that our state level government and our governor and our sheriff's department, everything from the state down to the local level, fully understands the importance of federalism. Right. And so to hear a governor in America, specifically in Florida, talk about how he understands and values federalism too, and state power, I hope that spreads throughout the country. And everybody is like, I can't wait for him to become president one day. And I'm like, I kind of like this state power vibe that he gives off, because he inspires other governors to step. He's moving the Overton window, and I love that. But let's move on to see what Hamilton said next, or Publius. So then he moves on from saying, like, basically it's safe to assume that we're going to face the same problems every other country's faced when it comes to hostilities, especially domestic. But then he says, but there are specific American-themed issues that we can already see in our future based on our very small history existing over the last 10 years. The Federalist says, unfortunately for us, the question admits of a more particular answer beyond the general lessons of world history. There are causes of differences within our immediate contemplation, of the tendency of which, even under the restraints of a federal constitution, we have had sufficient experience to enable us to form a judgment of what might be expected if those restraints were removed. And so what he's saying is, like, we already have the Articles of Confederation. It's technically this national level government, and we're already seeing quite some hostilities between states. What if that one small amount of coordination to hopefully get those states to cooperate and find solutions didn't even exist? What if that little shred of it didn't even exist? That would not be good. And that we've already seen that happen on our own soil. We don't just have to look to history and guess. So that really was interesting to me. It reminded me, you know those quotes where it's like, look at the people around you. That is yourself in 6 months. Ooh, you know that quote where it's like, if you are based on your own circumstances, if you can look at the things around you and say, I'm going to continue to spend my time with these people, I'm going to continue to invest in spending my time around these humans, I'm going to slowly become like them. I mean, it's kind of your own fault. And so it reminded me of that like basic quote that we hear a lot on like Pinterest and Instagram these days, because that's kind of what Publius is saying. He's like, you guys are telling me that even after we're already seeing these conflicts arise in the states, that we should now remove the one thing that's trying to get them to coordinate?
Yes.
Yeah. It's like, don't play stupid games, win stupid prizes. So what he says next, he kind of talks about examples. Publius goes, he says, territorial disputes have at all times been found one of the most fertile sources of hostility among nations. Perhaps the greatest proportion of wars that have desolated the earth have sprung from this origin. This cause would exist among us in full force. With that, let's set the scene, okay? Because we weren't the 50 nifty United States at the time,
right? Bring us back a little bit,
right? It's 1787, so let's have an understanding of what the heck was going on. Publius says, we have a vast tract of unsettled territory within the boundaries of the United States. There are still discordant and undecided claims between several of them, and the dissolution of the Union would lay a foundation of similar claims between them all. So I was looking into it because I was like, what do they mean? I didn't really know what states existed, what what land existed in our jurisdiction at the time of 1787, because it was like 10 years after the Revolutionary War, the Declaration of Independence. I looked into it, and basically any state that wasn't touching the Atlantic Ocean, like of the 13 original colonies, it was considered the frontier. And so there was a lot of land that was like, we were aware of it. It was kind of ours, but it was considered the frontier because they weren't states or anything like that. And so states were kind of competing of who should get what.
Who should get the land.
It was still technically land under the Articles of Confederation. But come on, who knows what's going on? So then I looked into it, and I was like, oh, wait, the Louisiana Purchase, what year was that? That was 1803. So that happened after the 1787 ratification of the Constitution. In 1803, and what it did is it doubled the size of America. I forgot some of these really basic things, but so I looked into it, and basically it was the land from the Mississippi River in the east to the east of the Rocky Mountains in the west, and then from the Canadian border in the north all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. That was added to America just a handful of years after we ratified the U.S. Constitution. What happened is it was in France's hands. It was French.
Yes.
And we bought it. We bought 828,000 square miles called the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon's France. We ended up buying it for 3 cents per acre. 3 cents. Can you imagine that now? I mean, you and I look at properties, or I do, and then I show them to you and I get all excited. But 3 cents per acre for a total of $11 million, or $11,250,000. And then we agreed to assume claims of American citizens against France for $3,750,000. So either way, it was 3 cents per acre is what we bought, and doubling the size of our country with the Louisiana Purchase. Now, we added like 15 states with the purchase of the Louisiana Territory. It was either like parts of states or whole states. 15 of them were added with this addition of the property. And it's considered one of the most important achievements of Thomas Jefferson's presidency. Now, there's a lot of arguing about this land, I'm sure you can imagine.
Oh, I assumed it was just smooth sailing, as most things are.
Okay, so this is the thing. It turns out that before the Revolutionary War ended, before we won, before we became our own country, a lot of the land that was just unknown or, unsettled, but, the Native American stuff, that's the whole other topic, unsettled by the Americans or the British, it was considered crown lands. And so in some situations, the crown had said like, oh, you can control this land, certain states, like we'll let you under our jurisdiction control these lands. But then others had no jurisdictions given to them by the crown, and these crown lands were just like, meh. So when the crown was no longer there was different approaches to how that should be handled, right? And so the states, obviously, that like controlled land under the crown's name, they were like, well, that still stands. like we're gonna hold on to that rule, right? And then the other states were obviously like, no, they're not here anymore, and that is up for grabs. And so that's where that first contention started to grow, and it already led to hostilities between the states even after the British left.
Right.
So knowing that the country is pretty much a very small amount of states before the purchase of the Louisiana Territory, you have pretty much just the East Coast of America settled so far, and all of this land is up for grabs. People are getting excited and antsy and competitive with each other. So that's a little nerve-wracking because that's a lot of money. I mean, imagine how much money was like possible for them, and they didn't even know it, I'm sure. But the Federalist goes to say, it has been the prudent policy of Congress to appease these controversies by prevailing upon the states to make cessions to the United States for the benefit of the whole. This has been so far accomplished as, under a continuation of the Union, to afford a decided prospect of an amicable termination of the dispute. A dismemberment of the Confederacy, however, would revive this dispute and would create others on the same subject. And so what he's saying, they at least have some setup under the Articles of Confederation to help solve these disputes, but without it, they're going to war.
There would be nothing.
They would go to war.
No checks and balances.
For sure. And that's where we get into Western territories, baby. Let's go. Now the Federalist says, at present, a large part of the vacant Western territory is, by cession at least, if not by any anterior right, the common property of the Union. So some states, like I said, had claim to the West, and they wanted that claim to remain, obviously. Other states did not have any claim, and they said, well, if it's common property of the Union now that we are our own government, then we want our fair share. Makes sense, right? I mean, it's like, well, we all fought the war together, and now this is all our land. Why would we follow the rules of the crown with who they disperse the land to?
When that's not the situation anymore.
And so that was leading to like a lot of hot debate. And then basically Publius, he's like, no matter which way we handle this, it's probably not going to be peaceful. Like there's going to be upset people, even if we as a government handle this from a national level and try to help everybody out. So what he says then is, in the wide field of Western territory, therefore, we perceive an ample theater for hostile pretensions, without any umpire or common judge to interpose between the contending parties. To reason from the past to the future, we shall have good ground to apprehend that the sword would sometimes be appealed to as the arbiter of their differences. The sword. Violence, people. Violence.
It's called violence, people. Violence.
So then we get into an example, and I like the examples that Publius uses because, again, it's like we look to the USSR, we look to Venezuela, to Cuba, to the Eastern Germany, and we look at all these examples and we say, look at this, look at this, look at this. There's a million examples of why we shouldn't follow this path.
Just in recent times.
Yeah, and that's, I love looking at what were our founders looking at to evaluate how they should make their decisions and what they should avoid. So his example, he was saying that Connecticut and Pennsylvania were fighting over Wyoming. Isn't that strange? Can you imagine?
I mean, naturally.
Like now I imagine like people in Connecticut, like nerdy
Wyoming?
flannel wearers. Like I think of like Lancaster, Pennsylvania, like all the dairy farms and stuff, and they're like fighting over Wyoming where the ranchers are now. Just that like stuff. I'm like, interesting. But yeah, so basically they were fighting about that, and in response, he says, the Articles of Confederation obliged the parties to submit the matter to a decision of a federal court. So, a court decides. I like that. The submission was made, and the court decided in favor of Pennsylvania. But Connecticut gave strong indications of dissatisfaction with that determination. Makes sense. Nor did she appear to be entirely resigned to it, till, by negotiation and management, something like an equivalent was found for the loss she supposed herself to have sustained. So I like that. So that they understood, obviously you have your desires to keep that land, but here's how we can mitigate any risk. We'll find you a similar substitute so that you don't feel disrespected after this decision. So then he says, nothing here said is intended to convey the slightest censure on the conduct of the state. So he's saying, we're not saying Connecticut is bad in any way for being upset with this ruling. And I like that. It's very civil. He says she no doubt sincerely believed herself to have been injured by the decision, and states, like individuals, acquiescence with great reluctance in determinations to their disadvantage. And so it reminded me of like humans. Like states are humans, and I think in a government where you are representing the people, we're a republic. It's a situation where the government represents the people, the population, in a really great and unprecedented way. Then states are going to have the same interests as individual humans in many ways, and they're going to have their own desires. And it's no shame for them to act in their own self-interest.
Right. And that's what it makes sense about, looking at human nature when we talk about these issues and how to handle them. It's like, yes, we are talking about nations and systems that have been built by human beings, so they are going to follow the trends that human nature follows.
And that we have that problem right now. I mean, I talk a lot about like our founders. They literally designed this government to be a government representing the people. And right now I think we are mentally, morally, spiritually, and physically weak humans. And then when you look at the leadership we choose for ourselves, it kind of makes sense. Like I was on Newsmax, and I was like, it was President Biden did something really stupid, and I was asked about it, and it was just one of those stupid things around the early time of the Afghanistan crisis. And I think it was on Grant Stinchfield's thing, and I was like, well, Grant, our government is a representation of the people. And so if you look at what Joe Biden does and you say, how could he do this? How could our leaders do this? How could Nancy Pelosi do this? You say, how could our leaders do this? Well, then you look at what the people in our country are doing and saying, and the things that they don't know, what they're not aware of. It's no surprise that we choose these people to elect us. And people have, their contentions about the previous elections. But at the end of the day, it wasn't just that election where we had somebody bad put in. It's that we're always electing these corrupt and greedy and shady politicians that get rich, that do not have our best interest in. And even if they mess up, we still bring them back year after year after year because they can just win after they have enough name recognition.
They just rebrand. Like we keep acting like something's the new concept, and that's how they get away with having nobody understand the historical implications of what's happening right now, is because they come up with new fun terminology and they rebrand it. And so people who are ignorant and who don't know how to recognize those common themes and trends, they will just fall for it over and over again. And that's what history is doomed to repeat itself is. It's not like that just happens once and then people learn from it again. It's like, no, when you have this ignorance, you cannot reclaim your ground on that. You will always fall victim to this ignorance.
Yeah, sheeple behavior.
Yes.
I'm sorry,
As
but
some would
it
say.
is. It's sheeple behavior, and I don't know. I was looking at this, and I really agree with this more and more now. Like when you look at all of history, for the most part, humans have been okay with being told what to do, okay with gliding through life, or okay with being guided and directed as long as their basic things are provided for them. And somebody was like making the case to me like, Morgan, we don't need some big enlightened moment where everybody in America wakes up. We just need enough people to wake up, because an enlightened minority is enough to change this country for the better and get us back on the road. But because right now, I don't think we're ever going to reach enough people to have this massive moment where everybody wakes up. That would have happened a long time ago, I think, honestly. If we were supposed to have that. I mean, look at the current events list. I think something would have happened by now, and it hasn't. But if we have an enlightened enough minority, or maybe even just 45% of the population that is aware and is saying, I'm going to actively work to change this and better myself and understand history and make sure we have good leaders, we'd be great. But right now, look how many people even participate in elections. That alone is such a great look.
Well, and people are naturally leaders or followers. And so you don't need everyone to have their own individual moment of waking up. You have the people who are clearly ready to follow and are going to listen to whatever's being told to them. They don't really have the care to take it into their own hands to educate themselves and to stand up for something. They just want to reiterate what is being told to them by their leaders. And so if we have strong leadership really setting the stage and educating these people and leading them like they're supposed to do, we wouldn't be in a lot of the issues that we are in today.
And that's what it's such a shame. I try and wonder, like, okay, then why don't we have better leaders? Because every time we hear from politicians on both sides, you hear these great promises, and it's not the people's fault for saying, okay, I would follow you, because we fall for it. We believe them. We think we can trust them for their word. Maybe that's the big mistake that we're all making, is we assume that we can actually trust these people. But it's really a shame, because even if you do work really hard to support someone and be a loyal follower in that way, it can still be disappointing. And for some reason, I think it's also the incentive of being in Washington, D.C., being a politician these days, being part of this huge, overblown federal government, because our founders never intended for it to get this big. They never saw this executive branch bureaucracy becoming what it is today. They never saw these huge bills coming out of Congress, passing over the decision making to the bureaucracy, any of this stuff. And that's what Paul Gosar and I talked about. They never saw any of this. And so I'm like, the experience and the benefits that you can privately and personally get from being in DC is incentivizing people to lie to the average Americans, to say that they're going to be, serving the public and all this stuff. They get into office and then, it's sayonara. But back to the topics. Sorry, I get on rants sometimes. I really like the little historical tidbits. And I think I've told you that before. But what's interesting is Publius then starts talking about how, like, listen, if you guys, I'm totally paraphrasing right now, but he basically says, like, if you listeners were able to see and be present in the rooms where the people are debating, like the representatives of the state are debating who's going to get what in these heated moments, like the Connecticut versus Pennsylvania situation, then you would know just exactly how close we really are to potentially go into war, and how our small government right now that does exist has done everything it possibly can to limit that and prevent it. But it's so close. And so he basically he's like, if you were a fly on the wall, you would know just how risky this is going to be if we remove the one thing that potentially encourages them. That's the kind of stuff I'm like, oh, ooh, good thing.
It's like
we
fighting with your
that
family. It's like if you're fighting with a stranger, there's a lot less incentivizing you to get along than if you're fighting with your family. There's going to be those arguments. There's going to be those moments of discontention. But when there is nothing that's binding you together, when there's no sense of unity, that's when things get out of hand.
Right? That's such a good point, because like you're supposed to prioritize blood, blood relations and stuff. And so that's why family is really important, because it's like family over everything, right? And so if you don't have that tie And if you don't feel like you're a member of a family, if you don't feel like you all are working for this common good of what the United States is, then of course you're not going to be like, yeah, let's get along, neighboring country. And in previous papers when you weren't here, Alex, that's what that's what the Federalists also said is like the anti-Federalists act like we're going to be brothers and neighbors, neighboring states. No, we're going to be with bordering no sense states of with unity. Each other. Yeah, he was like, we aren't neighbors, we're bordering countries. Yeah, and that is not good.
I like my family a lot more than I like my neighbors. I will say that.
And that's the thing. Like I'm really cheesy, so I wish that we had more neighborhood community gathering and stuff like that. But we're in a time, especially right now, where like people go out to the neighborhood mailbox and they're like, oh, I don't want to see anyone. Yeah, like us with our apartment neighbors. Oh,
yeah, we're like, oh, please, just like.
And that makes me sad. Like I want to be like, what if something bad happened? Like, wouldn't you want to be a part of my survival plan? But now you don't get to because you don't like me. Either way, so next thing is that he talks about like, okay, so why are guys even fighting right now? The people in different states, why are they even fighting over this property? One of them, well, he gives two like more important reasons. He said one of them is just like they have this jealousy of future power because at the time, 1787, we still don't have the Louisiana Purchase. The country's really small, but people are pretty aware that the land is pretty vast. It's just pretty unknown. Yes. And so everybody's kind of like antsy. They're like at the starting gate and they're like, oh, what's going to happen next? Right. And they're also like, they're kind of settling in as their states that they are, and they're able to see what their limitations are. And they're able to see, oh, well, like I'm New Jersey, New York has all the ports, or I'm Connecticut and New York has all the ports, and we have to pay for New York imported products that are going through their ports, and then we have to pay them, and then we're paying a tax to New York, and it's all this stuff. And so there was this jealousy of like a future power that the states could have if they got even more property and more resources out in these unknown territories, and that was one of the big things. But also, speaking of like DC selfishness and all these politicians, this was also a worry back then. He said a lot of the problems right now are the fact that guys with financial incentive have way too much power and are going unchecked in the states. And this was in other papers as well of right now you have completely unchecked power in states. And if we didn't have a federal government, there would be completely unchecked power in the states. You'd still have centralized power. The centralized power would just be the leaders of the state, and there's no check on them. Do you want to be in a situation like that, or do you want to be in a situation where, yes, there's state power, but there's at least somebody at the federal level to check them, and then the state powers can also check the federal. Right. So that's why it's a little safer, because it's a give and take there, back and forth. But he's saying that a lot of the land fights were because guys that had too much power in the states had selfish and personal reasons because they were given land grants in a lot of these unsettled areas and these places that were just territories at the time. And so they wanted to keep their financial incentive and make sure that their state got control of those properties because they already had the land grants. So as soon as you start to hear about that, it's like, I could say I'm disappointed because I wish the early founders of America were better and didn't have these arguments and stuff. But it's, again, human nature. Yes. Human nature. We will be like that.
And I think that it's a difficult conversation to have when we have any sort of discussion about the role that the federal government should play, especially as conservatives, because of, like you said earlier, how much the federal government is involved in right now, how big it's gotten, that it's just totally unprecedented, the amount of control over stuff that the federal government has. So when we actually have genuine conversations about the things that the federal government was put in place in order to preserve and protect and the actual purpose of it, people don't even know these things. People don't even know the purpose of the federal government. And so that is also just internally where you get a lot of issues because you have people looking to the federal government to handle all of their problems that should be handled on a state level and on a community level that the federal government has no interest in even touching on.
Or the leftists in federal government definitely want to touch on it. They definitely want like, control.
Give me more.
But they should not. That's the thing is like it's what the government should not be handling at the federal level. And I was in the I was putting like my makeup on for the show actually, and I like to listen to just like long videos and stuff or podcasts. And I got on this video of it was Don Lemon and Ben Carson talking about, it was just like all these times that Ben Carson like totally slammed Don Lemon, if we're being honest. And so I really enjoyed it.
Own compilation.
So like Ben Carson, he just talks really slowly and calmly. And I think he's a real sweetie.
Yeah, he's like so poised.
Right? And so he's just so kind. Like he looks like he would, like you would never expect him to be in politics. And that's what I love about him because he's like, he's a doctor and now he's a public servant. And I love that. So Don Lemon was like, I want to talk back to your time in the presidential primary when you were running. You said that Obamacare was the worst thing to happen to America since slavery. Why do you think Obamacare is worse than slavery? And so then Ben Carson very calmly goes, well, I think to anybody listening to that, it's pretty clear that that's not what I said. But that would require them to have basic understanding of the English language. He just said something like that. And he was like, well, if you know what it means to say worst thing since, then you know that I didn't say it's worse than slavery. So then Don Lemon's like, but it's still,
the manipulation of language.
Jim Crow. He's like talking. And so Ben Carson was like, I mean, again, with what happened is Don Lemon was like, you said that people need to calm down in America and not be so hostile. Don't you think that's a really like divisive thing to say? And Ben Carson's response was, no, I think, misinterpreting and trying to lie about what I meant when I said that is pretty hostile and divisive.
Yes.
Not what I said. And most people listening are able to comprehend that I'm saying it's not as bad as slavery,
right,
but the worst thing since slavery. And then he goes on to say, and you're listing all these things off. You're listing Jim Crow and all these bad things that have happened in American history. But there's something totally different when you consider restructuring the entire United States federal government to taking control over something like someone's health. It's the most important thing they have, their health and ability to live a life.
Yes.
Their ability to live. That is everything. And he says, like you and I said, this is literally our conversation that we just had. He says, if you look at all of history, what happens as soon as the government starts taking over healthcare? It's never a good situation. Nope. And it's not that I'm trying to be hostile or argue. This is a well-known fact of human history. Yeah. And so it is a very terrible thing to happen in America because it's a step transitioning completely our role of the federal government in our own lives. And I was just like, how can I meet this guy? So after we started going into the topic of fighting over land, fighting over the unclaimed territory on American soil, there were some other ones that he kind of briefly brings up. One of them is competitions of commerce. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but what I loved about it is he was like, we're America, baby. We've got a spirit of trade and commerce. And it was the start of really the most successful capitalist country you've ever seen. I mean, in 1787, we obviously hadn't seen it much yet, but embracing classical liberalism, which is basically the principles of the Constitution, the principles of the Bill of Rights, combined with economic independence, that was unprecedented. And it's why America is what it is today. And so they saw that like we have this spirit of entrepreneurship, of trade, of commerce, and that is good. But also it could lead to some things because we are self-interested people in a good way. We want to get the best for ourselves, for the people around us, and for our states. And so he said it's only natural that states and people are going to want to desire what's in their best interest commerce-wise. Right. On American soil, in America, because that's just how we've been for the last 10 years. So the example he gives was what I mentioned earlier, where it's New York, in their sense, like they're the strong guys because they've got these huge ports. And as everybody's settling into what their role is as states, what their economy looks like individually, New York was imposing taxes on the goods brought through the ports in New York State. And so that meant New Jersey and Connecticut and those close by states were having to pay taxes basically to New York, and they didn't really like that. And so Publius's question was, how long are the people of those states, especially if they are disunited, going to be willing to pay taxes on the state of New York products before they get a little hostile, before there starts to be conflict, whether that's conflict just in terms of fighting over if we can have a better agreement for trade or if maybe one of them tries to seize the ports.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's what we're dealing with there. The other one is there was debt because we fought a Revolutionary War. Yeah. And it was expensive.
Which it's a good thing that that's not an issue anymore when we talk about if we have a national divorce. We're doing great on the debt front.
Imagine if we divided like the trillions of dollars between the states.
What are you going to do?
That'd be so sad.
It's like poor Delaware over here is just having to take part of the national debt.
It's like, did you see
trillions?
Governor DeSantis was like, I will bust these illegal immigrants to Delaware so fast. When he said that, I was like, I love it. I'm a little bitter, so I love it. But so like we had a huge debt at the time, considered huge debt for the Revolutionary War because we had foreign countries help us with it. And they were saying, okay, so say we split up. that doesn't just dissolve the debt. So what's going to happen?
So where does it go?
There's like, if you think of like divorced couples, that's
Like-
what went to my mind of like
children.
couples fighting over like kids
Yeah.
and property and even debt and
The
like
house, yeah.
who pays for what? Because like who's going to have the mortgage payment on the house? There's that
And like
song.
who gets the couch? Like every little thing
Right?
is
Well, it's
being
like I'm
fought
going through
over.
the big D and don't mean Dallas. Like he's like she got the big, like you know that?
No.
You've never heard that song?
I'm
Oh
just
my
gonna
gosh.
go with you there though.
It's a great country
Pretend.
song, and he's like, I'm going through the big D, and I don't mean Dallas. He's going through the divorce, and he's like, she gets the car and the house and the dogs and the kids, but then he's like, but she still has the mortgage payment for that house, so I guess I'm kind of good. And so in that sense, it's like, imagine just a couple arguing about like divorce and who gets what and who has to take on what responsibilities. Imagine all of the states in the Articles of Confederacy in the United States saying we're gonna all split. And who's going to take the debt? You think we're not going to go to war over that one if we're going to go over to war of all these other things?
Like we are just at the ready to go to war.
Like,
we're going to
humans
be
just go
looking
to war
at
over
every
everything.
little thing that we can. Like that's part of human nature too, is how much power can you get
Yeah.
from the circumstances? How can we utilize every circumstance that we are in order to gain more power? So that is going to be the prime time for all of those people with their
Who wants
grubby
to
little
pay the
hands.
debt? So basically, like this one makes so much sense to me because I'm like, yeah, I would actually be really mad. Basically, Publius has a few things on this. He's like, okay, so how do we, if we're going to fairly split it, how are we going to split it between all the states? Or say we split into like 3 or 4 confederacies. How do you know who is more responsible for the debt, or are we splitting it evenly? And then if we split it evenly, can all the states afford it in that same way?
Right.
So what's proper proportions? That's going to be a whole thing, and that's
Which
going
there's
to lead to
not like a
hostilities.
set way to do that. So there's going to
No.
be contention over any way that you do decide, even if you do reach a decision.
Mhm.
It's like the same thing with Connecticut. It's like they're not happy. You think that, the
and
states
there's
that
no
can't
fixing that
afford to
one.
pay their fair share of the national debt are going to be happy when their entire economies tank within like the first few minutes of being their own nation?
Right, and then so that's the thing is then Publius is like, so then it's going to tank some people's economies, and then you're going to have arguments between the states because then you're going to have rich countries and poor, and that was in previous papers.
Yes.
It's like if you all split up into different countries, some are going to try some styles of like an economic system or a government system, and it's going to lead to different levels of success and different levels of power, and then they're going to start invading each other because they're like, oh, they're weak, I think we could conquer them. Like that's how human
Right.
history is. The strong ones invade the weak to start taking them over and growing their base, and that's what would happen if we start having good economies and bad economies. You start having these problems. So then he says basically every single attempt on top of this, even if we tried this, is going to come with major objection. But what he really said is like, there's definitely going to be contention if some of the states pay it right away and then others don't. And that reminded me of like roommates and rent. Like, did you
Right.
live in college where like 5 girls in a house? I had that, and I had a lot of friends, like all these girls. Oh, you didn't go to college.
Correct.
Alice didn't go to college, which I,
I
think
was
is
like,
awesome.
Are you just
My
like
bad.
tricking me?
No,
Alex,
but I
bring
mean,
up how
like
you're not educated.
when you're in college and there's like 6 girls in a house, and then it's like, oh, well, she stays in the shower a long time. Why are we all paying the same water bill? Or like she hasn't paid her rent in 2 months, and like we've all been paying it in. And she says she's going to pay us back on Venmo, so we're not. So it was like reading through this, I was like, it's such human nature to get mad at people
Right.
about like being late for a payment or being or not like being a full contributing team member. Obviously, it's going to happen when you're talking about like millions of dollars.
Well, and I also think about what would happen in order to get these kind of bailouts that you would need in to maybe resolve some of that debt, and how messy that would get. Like you think of like the mob and the mafia. You think about sorority girls,
Oh my gosh.
and I'm like the mafia, and that's
You
what I
don't
think
wanna
about
have debt
is
to a
when
mafia.
states start working with each other in order to dissolve other people's debts and creating this kind of loyalty. Is that it's just not sustainable, and for all of these people to operate as their own nations, because again, if you are outstanding on certain debt payments, there's going to be some probably pretty shady deals that happen in order to resolve those.
Alex, great point. I mean, I've seen like Sopranos and stuff. If you have debt, if you are sketchy
I
with
saw that
money,
one
you
with
are
the cat
going.
scene.
You're going in the freezer. Can I say that? I don't know, but you're going in the freezer,
I?
but Revolutionary War style, tar and feather, maybe.
Yes.
Maybe something like
You're
that.
getting tarred and feathered.
I don't know.
by the
People were
mob.
aggressive back then. But so this one's even funnier. I want your reaction to this. What comes to mind when you hear this quote? This is what Publius said all of these problems that we just discussed could potentially lead to. So it's a little ironic. That's why I
Okay.
want you to hear.
I'm excited.
So he
I hope I
says,
get it.
If even the rule adopted should in practice justify the equality of its principle, still delinquencies in payment on the part of some of the states would result from a diversity of other causes: the real deficiency of resources, the mismanagement of their finances, accidental disorders in the administration of government, and so on and so on.
Well, this whole time that we're talking about this, and there is like this, the conversation is basically about, okay, well, if we were to do this, what points of contention may arise? And then when you look at the current conversation about having a national divorce, it's like, well, they were saying don't do it when there was a potential about contention. The time we're in right now is it exists. And so it's kind of this mirrored effect of kind of what they were talking about back then. It's not split up and then you may have these problems. We have these problems and now we're talking about splitting up. That is a no-go. That is not going to go over well for anybody.
That, and what really got me on this is, like, they're saying, well, you know, some states aren't going to manage their finances well, and there might be some, you know, mismanagement of administrations of government in certain states and deficiency of resources. And all I could think as I'm reading this is like, oh, we go through that a lot, because some states, blue states, liberal states, leftist states like California and New York are in so much debt, Alex. They already mismanage their funds. They are so irresponsible. And unfortunately, now our government, what I'm so mad about, is we bail them out. Do you know how many states are dependent on the federal government to pay for like all of their programs? That's such a big problem here, is that financially states, especially the blue states, are dependent on the federal government for funds for their basic state level programs. And then that means the federal government can say, well, we have these new executive orders from like the Biden administration, and unless you comply with these mandates and these new orders, you're not getting your funds that you need. And then your whole state's going to shut down. And so it's really angering to a lot of the more conservative states, because they're like, can you just get your act together? Because that's our taxpayer dollars that we're sending to you now.
And then people move from those states to our states. We're in Arizona, so that's been happening a lot. You don't drive around without seeing probably half of the license plates being California license plate. I came from California, so I know I'm kind of pot calling the kettle on that one, but I have a question. If we were to get some sort of national divorce, and I think this is an issue too, is that a lot of people are using this phrase and they're talking about this concept and nobody has created any sort of plan for what this would actually look like. So why are we advocating for something that we don't even know? Like, say that tomorrow everyone was like, yeah, like actually let's do this thing. I know that it doesn't work that way, but what are we actually going to do? What is it that we're actually advocating for? And you get yourself in a very sticky situation when you start advocating for things that you don't understand, when you have no actual course of action, and yet you're, you know, standing up on your soapbox asking for something to happen. My major question is, if we separate the states, if we have this national divorce, when those more liberal states start failing, which we already see happening right now, what happens when those people want to change nations, change their countries? And then what kind of representation do these more conservative states have for their people? What is it to even preserve that separation would last? How do you preserve those different ideologies being located on a map and keep those people in those boxes? That's not how human nature is. Nobody's going to stay in their lane. These people are not passive people that just want to stay in their lane and let conservatives do their things. They want to dox us and destroy us.
Well, yeah. And so Federalist Paper number 10, like, that is the most infamous Federalist paper of the 85 of them. And it's because it talks about factions. And it says, like, people don't just naturally disagree with each other on basic things. It's because they live a lifestyle. They have certain careers. They live in certain areas. They have a lifestyle that leads to them having certain worldviews. And that automatically puts people at contention because they completely disagree on the basics. And so Federalist Paper number 10 is like, how do you get these very different people to want to even be next to each other or coordinate? That was the whole goal of the Union, is to say, we may be different. We may have different states and stuff, but that's okay if we all work to a greater purpose. Now, if we're all separated, what I think is like Chaz and Chop. Remember those? Chaz and Chop versus like Utah.
I was thinking about this too.
What?
Yes.
Chaz and Chop versus the people of Texas, where my house is. Are you kidding me?
Jazz and chop.
Like, and that's the thing. Those people, it's the same thing with liberals
Yes.
where they're like, why do we even have a military? Like, we are just oppressive people, and we're war criminals and stuff like that. Or we've been in this endless war. Honestly, we haven't. We have military presence in every country that we used to be at war with. That's all it was in Afghanistan at the point. We had like
Yes.
maybe 2,000 troops. But what frustrates me is these people can't understand. It's because people in the Middle East want to kill us. They hate us. If they could, they
Yes.
would take another plane and they'd fly it into another one of our buildings, and we'd have 9/11 after 9/11 after 9/11. These people want to murder us and destroy our way of life. So we have to have a military and a military presence in those areas and security in those areas to make sure that we're monitoring these crazy people.
Right, so
Same
that they're
thing-
not here on our soil.
Yeah, and so same thing with these naive people that are like, oh, why do we have to have military presence in other countries? Because the whole world is trying to get us, because there's third world countries out there with
Right.
third world mindsets.
And that's why everyone hates America, is because we are exceptional. People kind of use that as a talking point. They're like, well, every other country hates us and thinks that we suck. And it's like, well, yeah, that's honestly probably a good thing, because those are not great countries. Like,
Yeah.
you don't say like,
Like,
oh,
okay.
this really bad person I know doesn't really like me, so I'm
Yeah.
going to try to be more like what they want me to be.
Yeah, guess
No.
what? Millions of people are dying to try and get in here. So thank you so much. Case closed. But that's like that same naive mentality is also here on American soil, where it's like people are like, why do we have to worry about this? Because there's a whole population here that wants to end this style of life. And if we were disunited, it would rise up in certain areas and there would be massive internal conflict. Do you want that? And let's close off here, because that's exactly what I wanted to get into. So this is one of those situations where it's not like the anti-federalists were super they weren't really disagreeing with the federalists on this. It's not like there was one says this, one says the
Right.
other. Instead, the anti-federalists were also saying, like, we don't want civil war either. We don't want conflict on our soil. But they thought that the Constitution, because at the time there wasn't a Bill of Rights, they thought the proposed Constitution would actually lead to civil war, that it would lead to tyranny, that it would lead to oppression and stuff like that. So that was their concern. But both sides are very much against anything that could lead to us to fighting, and they just disagreed on how to achieve it. And so first thing I want to say before we go into their closing statements is the Federalist, they had a really good last point of what could lead to contention, and it was what you brought up earlier. It was moral obligation and social justice, and I think that's what we have in America today.
That's what's driving it all right now.
Yeah. And so basically he said, like, based on the tension between the states that we've already seen, quote, we reasonably infer that in similar cases under similar circumstances, a war not of parchment, so paper, but of the sword would chastise such atrocious breaches of moral obligation and social justice. Social justice, I did not know that they were using that word back then in 1787, but he said that that is probably one of the biggest causes that could lead to us on America having physical contact, physical fighting with the sword. And I think today of like the way the left phrases things, they act like it's such a moral high ground to stand. I mean, for COVID-19, they look what they've done just for a disease or a virus with 99% survival rate at least. But now they're telling us that we're killing the planet. And President Joe Biden himself said that climate change is going to murder the world, is going to lead to the end of the world, the catastrophe. When our leaders are talking like that, and when you're telling half the population to believe this, all the left, that climate change will lead to the end of the world, yeah, you're going to have some people that start to say, okay, then I'm willing to fight for something like that. They think they're these moral, social justice warriors.
Well, think about just another human nature thing. How strongly people react when there is a threat of danger. I mean, you look at the War of the Worlds situation, just a radio broadcast where people thought aliens were invading, and they just move out of their cities, they kill themselves, like they have these huge reactions, and basically what you have is a people that are reacting to this fear-mongering that is being propagated by our government. People in power who are making people afraid because they know that people who are afraid can easily be controlled. And that is where people are the safest to them, is when they are controlled.
Absolutely. Let's close it off with what each of them ended with. The Federalists ended with this mentality that, like, listen, after all these factors that we've discussed, it's pretty clear that there's going to be a lot of causes for us to probably fight with each other. And most importantly, as we've discussed in all the rest of the papers, our foreign enemies, or even our allies, will want for us to be divided.
Yes.
That is why we should stay united. It's why we should unite in an even stronger way. So the Federalists, they referenced a Latin term, which is basically divide and command. I'm not even going to try and pronounce it, but divide and conquer. Divide and command, divide and conquer. And that's what our enemies will want to do with us if we are divided. So it's even more important for us to stay together so that we can protect ourselves from foreign and domestic dangers. Now, the anti-federalists, this is kind of what you were saying earlier, so much chaos and suffering will be caused if we fight today in America now and back in 1787. So for everybody out there that wants to cheaply or even jokingly bring up national divorce or civil war or getting California to detach and having Texas go detach as well, understand that our founders fully evaluated all of human history and said, okay, we are not going to be strong. We are going to be incredibly weak and at the will of our enemies if we go and become disunited states. So this is by the anti-federalists. Of all the plagues that infest a nation, a civil war is the worst. Famine is severe. Pestilence is dreadful. But in these, though, men die. They die in peace. The father expires without the guilt of the son, and the son, if he survives, enjoys the inheritance of his father. Cities may be thinned, but they neither plundered nor burnt. But when a civil war is kindled, there is then forth no security of property nor protection from any law. Life and fortune become precarious, and all that is dear to men is at the discretion of profligate soldiery, doubtly licentious on such an occasion. Cities are exhausted by heavy contributions or sacked because they cannot answer exorbitant demand. Countries are eaten up by the parties they favor and ravaged by the one they opposed. Fathers and sons sheath their swords in another's bowels in the field, and their wives and daughters are exposed to rudeness and lust of ruffians at home. And when sword has decided quarrel, the scene is closed with banishments, forfeitures, and barbarous executions that entail distress on children then unborn. May heaven avert the dreadful catastrophe. From despotism and tyranny, good Lord, deliver us. That's for all those boys out there that sit behind microphones and talk about how we should go to civil war to save the country. Any thoughts on that one?
Heavy.
Heavy.
It's heavy.
It is heavy.
It paints such a picture, though. And I think one of the things that, I kind of noticed in the reading of these Federalist Papers is just how eloquently everything is communicated for a purpose. Is that, yes, you have these pictures of war and the things that people go through. It's not just a talking point when we talk about these things. It's not just a point to own the other side, to have the best idea. If these things happen, they will have real life implications. We talk about the value of life and the way that is put into danger if these things were to happen. It is not going to be something that's smooth sailing. It's not so simple as, we're talking about a national divorce in order to avoid a civil war, and that's going to be the end of the conversation. No, these things are messy, they're dangerous, and they lead to a lot of death. And that is something that we should really hold strongly when we have any of these conversations. Yeah,
this is to avoid long-term suffering. It might seem like a great idea right now, but long-term suffering, there's a reason we've been around for almost 300 years.
Yes.
Alex Spencer, thanks for joining me on Freedom Papers. I would love for you to come back.
Thank you.
You guys, thanks for listening to another episode. I hope this makes you not want a civil war and to instead look to what our founders said, look to what they looked at throughout human history to say, wow, it's probably best for us to stay united and find ways to work together. But again, go to tpusa.com/AmericaFest. Use code Morgan for 25% off your ticket. We will be there at the end of December, right before Christmas. We're super excited. Follow us on @Freedom Papers Podcast on Instagram, and I'll see you next week. Thank you so much for listening.